I'm Katie King and I run a company called AI in Business. And I've written this book on the impact of artificial intelligence on organizations of all different shapes and sizes and sectors, including education. And I'm absolutely delighted to have a great panel of guests, some of whom have stayed up all night. Peter is in Canada, so it's the early hours of the morning there. And we have guests, we have our panel from Cyprus, originally South Africans, and also Nick joining us from Australia. So a truly international group of people, and I believe guests dialing in from all over the world as well. So thank you to all of you for making the time and for joining us this morning. Really, we're talking here about the fourth generation, fourth industrial relations, really getting started and having an impact on all different industry sectors. And I think it's fair to say the education sector is one that's struggling to keep up. It's certainly not one of the ones that's ahead of the pack. And what we're going to be exploring through this webinar are the implications for the organizations themselves, for the educators, the implications for the students, the opportunities that are there if people are able to grasp them, and what it actually means, how they can go about doing that in a way that is cost effective but future proofs them as well. So we'll be exploring lots of really interesting and important subjects around explainability, and the use of technology, transparency and ethics and so on. So that's what we're going to be covering this morning. And our first speaker is Nick Kyrinos, who is the CEO and founder of Sophos. Sophos is the world's first AI-powered knowledge bot. And he also founded Fountech AI, which is our partner for hosting this morning's webinar. And this is a company which is driving innovation in the AI sector and helping consumers, businesses, and governments to understand how technology can make the world a better place. So delighted to partner with Fountech for this webinar. I've been really impressed with their proofs of value and proof of concept work, and I'm introducing them actually to quite a lot of my clients who are looking at how do we actually get started with artificial intelligence. So very practical, very real, a very impressive team of people. So over to you, Nick. We'd love to hear your views on the impact of AI in this very important sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody who's attending, fellow panelists too. Iran, Marina, thanks for pulling this together. Hugely important conversation. So very, very briefly, I've been building AI applications for going on 4 decades now. A few years ago, I decided that I needed to apply my knowledge to something that would make a difference in the world. And I looked at a lot of different societal, global problems that I should be addressing. And the one that sort of jumped out at me was education and learning. I spent a couple of years speaking to anyone and everyone who would have a conversation with me about what learning needs to look like. Obviously, we have a lot of opinions as to what needs to change or where education's going, given the ever-changing world. And we built a company called Sophos, and I'm not going to go into a whole promotion piece about Sophos, but essentially it ties into the topic of this webinar, which is learning in 2040, right? So that's 2 decades from now. So 2 decades, given the technological advancements that are happening today, is a long way out, and a lot's going to happen between now and then. So it's quite a stretch of the imagination to try and figure out where we will be then. But I will attempt to give my thoughts and our view on how individualized one-to-one learning, so one teacher, one student, where it's hyper-personalized, will make its way into learning in 20 years from now, 2 decades from now. So what is the importance of one-to-one learning? If you look at what's happening in the world, first of all, we have a dire shortage of teachers, and it's exaggerated in numerous parts of the world. Secondly, we have an ever-growing population. Most importantly, knowledge is exploding at a faster rate than ever before. So the ability to convert that knowledge into a taxonomy, into a curriculum, into curricula that will then be taught to people who'll be doing jobs that don't exist today 2 decades from now, or when they finish school, is a task that is very taxing on educational systems, whether it be pre-K, K through 12, higher ed, corporate learning, lifelong learning. Therefore, the only way I believe we're going to arrive at a model where we truly have a one-to-one learning environment which maximizes learning is through artificial intelligence. And as I know some of the other panelists will say too, it's not about AI replacing teachers. Teachers are not going away. In fact, this is about taking away some of that 60% non-teaching stuff they do, eliminating the shortage by assisting and augmenting to enable them to impart the sort of non-knowledge aspect of learning to students, right? So the human aspects, mentoring, guiding, helping them navigate this labyrinth of knowledge that's exploding at an ever-increasing rate. So that's what we're working on in Sophos. Where I envision learning to be 2 decades from now is not just technologically different, but philosophically different, right? So I don't see a situation where we will have 8, 10, 12 subjects, where we will have 12 years of school and then university and then we're done. I see us moving to a buffet model where we learn what we need to enable us to perform a certain job in the future, but also better learn how to learn so that we can continue a lifelong learning journey. I see teachers, as I said, playing a more human role and having the time to spend more time with their students, helping them with projects, working on projects together, encouraging peer-to-peer learning. So having students work together on using what they've learned, the way they would in a work environment, right? So to achieve that, AI needs to be able to assimilate the explosion of knowledge into a taxonomy, break it up into micro subjects or micro lessons that can be weaved together into broader subjects that can be applied to lifelong endeavors. It needs to be able to assist in assessing engagement. And I'm not talking about using pure emotion detection or sentiment analysis, because to my knowledge, there is no science that says if somebody looks happy and is smiling during a lesson, that means they learned and they're learning and are engaged. What we're doing is looking at the same micro expressions, but then doing an assessment later to determine whether they absorbed and learned, and then we truly learn what learning looks like, what understanding looks like, what engagement looks like. And then using that to inform teachers during their sessions, during lessons, and so on, so that they're able to better personalize and assist and individualize the learning experience. What I'm talking about is a massive endeavor, and it's going to take us 2 decades to get to where we ultimately want to be, right? So the 2040 is not coincidental. We've decided to start on the corporate learning environment because currently learning and development is very fragmented. It's arguably not enjoyable by most people. It's something they have to do. And in many cases, companies do it for compliance reasons, right? To check a few boxes. What we're creating is something that's inspired by the Socratic method, where Sophos will ingest all corporate-wide knowledge that is approved by corporate administrators. It'll store it in a knowledge representation system that retains semantic integrity and then enables employees who have access to different aspects of that knowledge to have conversations, right? So they can ask questions, get answers, or they can have Sophos ask them questions. So it's completely conversational. And I'm not talking about the types of chatbots where you see today where they are pre-scripted decision trees. This is pure free flow conversation that people will enjoy having. So I'm on the way to a sales meeting and I need to know about product X, right? And maybe I learned about it 6 months ago, but none of us have perfect recall, right? So I'll be able to say, Sophos, please remind me, what is this attribute of product X? And it'll respond with the knowledge, the nugget of knowledge that I need in that moment, right? And in return, I could say, could you test me on product X? Just ask me a few questions. Let me see if I understand what product X is all about. So trying to summarize this vision in 10 minutes obviously is impossible. I hope I've given you a couple of glimpses. I'm going on 9 minutes. So out of respect to the rest of the panelists, I'm going to pause there and hopefully get into more of this during the Q&A. So over to
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Nick, and for being prompt. Appreciate that. Really encouraging, actually, really positive but realistic points there. And your message regarding individualism, I talk a lot from my research, a year of research in the book, about that personalization, and very much echoes with the world of corporate learning, as you say. So thank you for those insights. Next up, we have Professor Rose Luckin. Rose is the Director of Educate at the University College London. And that's, for those of you that are not familiar with it, a London hub for educational technology startups. So very appropriate to this discussion this morning. Rose is seen in the sort of top 20 people to watch in education, and hugely impressive. And I was very grateful. Rose has been inspiring some young students that I've been running a pilot program with, where we're looking to close the skills gap on the impact of AI in business. So very, very impressive, and we look forward to hearing your views now. So over to you, Rose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie, for that lovely introduction, and also to Nicholas for that great opening. So optimistic and just perfect. I hope what I'm going to say is very complimentary to that. So I've been working in the area of AI and education for about 25 years as an academic. And then with my other hat, I run a startup which is taking forward the Educate program that Katie has just mentioned. So it's very dear to my heart. And I thought it was really interesting that Katie's introduction brought in the subject of the fourth industrial revolution, because if we look back to December 2019, I think that was the thing that most of us working in AI and education who were interested in thinking about the impact that AI was going to have on education and training were probably thinking about. The way in which AI in the workplace is changing the kinds of things that we need to help young people to understand, to know, skills, expertise, and then thinking about how we could use AI to support them in that and to support their teachers and mentors. And then come March, of course, COVID-19 arrives and everything changes for those people in schools and colleges and universities, as well as in work. And it's created a real opportunity, I think, for us to be able to move more quickly with the mission and the vision to get AI being used much more widely and appropriately in education and training. As Katie pointed out right at the start, we're a bit of a laggard in education, and yet there's so much we can do. Just listening to Nicholas, that's so right. That personalization, that hyper-personalization is so important and so valuable, for example, for students who've fallen behind during the pandemic. So huge potential, and the pandemic has brought education into using edtech in a much greater way. And I think that creates a wonderful platform for increasing the use of AI. However, at the same time, of course, we've had a little blip along the way in the last couple of weeks with the chaos in the UK around the A-level and the GCSE grading algorithm, which raised huge concerns, and for me just demonstrated once again how you need to really be careful about the data that you select when you're using an algorithm. And some people may feel that algorithm wasn't true AI, it certainly wasn't machine learning, but I think for most people, they would look at it and say, well, that's doing something intelligent, so let's think of it as AI. But it certainly wasn't one that was careful enough about the data that it selected, about the way that it was tested, or indeed the premise that it started from, i.e. we need to keep standardization. We don't want grade inflation. So it really emphasized the important thing about understanding what we want our AI to achieve, and then making sure that we use the appropriate data as well as the appropriate algorithm. And as I work through, the many years I've been working in the area of AI in education, I become increasingly convinced that it's the data and the imperative of the algorithm that is way more influential and important than the algorithm itself. So you might be able to tweak an algorithm to improve it, but if it's still got the wrong data, it's not going to achieve what you need. So I think it's taught us, and I hope it's raised public awareness about how much we need to understand more about AI and algorithms. So on the one hand, we've had this positive injection with greater use of technology within education and training. And then we've had this blip that's raised alarm bells around the use of algorithms to make decisions. So we're in an interesting position now. And I think it really highlights the huge problem that we face. And that is that not enough people understand what AI is, or why data is so important to machine learning, artificial intelligence, and why we really need to try and focus on helping as many people as possible to understand much more about what AI is capable of, what it's not capable of, and in particular, thinking about data. And I don't mean by this, everybody needs to learn to code an AI algorithm, absolutely not. But they do need to understand the role of data and the role of AI if we're really going to leverage it within education. So we need particularly the educators and the trainers to understand that, so that they are in a much better position to work with AI in education. And the whole piece around data and data literacy, I think, is a key piece of the puzzle that we need to get in place. So for example, the business that I run has been working with various different organizations, but the one that I think is particularly relevant here is a training organization where we've been helping them to leverage AI. They came to us with a problem. They were training lots of staff, and then after they'd spent a lot of money training them, the staff were leaving. And so they thought that what they needed was an AI enhancement to their training platform. But we said, well, hang on a minute, let's just find out a bit more about that problem. So we actually looked at all of the data that the company already had, and we collected some extra data, in particular richer multimodal data, such as audio data, such as personality data, such as characteristics of the individuals within the business. And then we used some AI modeling techniques to actually highlight to the organization the different sorts of employees they were training and the way in which these different sorts of employees were likely to need extra support, not to need extra support. And what that has led to is a decision that actually what the company needs is an AI to help with recruitment decisions and an AI to help with mentoring on building the relationships in the workplace between managers and those staff who've been trained. So it was a very different use of AI to the one that the company started thinking that they needed. And that was because we helped them to become more data literate about their own organization, to understand the training problem that they really faced. And then, of course, we can build the AI with them to deliver what they need. And that brings me to my final point about the best way forward in these circumstances. Yes, we certainly need to help, particularly people in education training, to become more data and AI literate. And we run a program precisely to do that. But really thinking longer term about the kind of AI applications that we need in education and training, I honestly believe the best way forward is the development of appropriate, acceptable AI through multi-stakeholder partnerships, co-design partnerships with educators and AI developers working together using lean, agile methodologies to learn from each other. In the process, the AI developers start to understand a great deal more about teaching and learning. The people who understand teaching and learning, our educators and trainers, understand more about AI. So we end up helping different populations understand more about what they need in order to build more appropriate, acceptable and effective AI. And we also end up with much better applications of AI in education and training. And that's certainly the kind of methodology that we operate with the companies that we work with through our Educate program. It's all about helping companies to see how they can use their data in particular to help them understand whether their product or service is or is not delivering the benefits, the potential of the impact that that product or service can have on teaching and learning. And so we use this multi-stakeholder co-design partnership approach to connect the people who build the technology with the people who use the technology, and the people like ourselves, the researchers and the AI and data experts who can help you leverage that data and evidence. And I'm going to stop there and pass back to Katie. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this event tremendously. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it, Katie.
Thank you very much, Rose. Fantastic once again, and really important point there. Educators, of course, are in the business of educating people, but they are organizations as well, and they have recruitment, they have marketing and sales related activities to do as well. And I know Peter's going to be talking to a couple of those points too. So a hugely inspiring presentation. Thank you, Rose. Our third speaker this morning, dialing in from Australia, fellow Brit, but over in Australia, is Nick Burnett, who is Managing Director of Team Teach Asia Pacific and the co-founder of Learn Tech Lab. So looking forward to hearing from you, Nick, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks very much for the invite. Very, very honoured to be part of this panel. And one of the key things I wanted to talk about was the importance of mindsets. And just sort of linking on from what Nick said and what Rose said, is one thing that becomes really important to me is actually, and this is a very big question, which we're certainly not going to resolve today, is what's the purpose of education? Starting really a big one in terms of that, and how I've deliberately started separating education and learning, which is a bit sad. I've been an educator all my life and ex-school principal, that actually seeing that schooling as we generally see it is not fulfilling what we need it to do in many ways. So I think there's a key piece for me in certain mindsets we might need to unlearn, whether that's as a parent, as a teacher, as a researcher in AI, whatever else it might be. We tend to have certain constraints on our thinking, and so I'm really conscious about what we need to unlearn to really unearth, I guess, the huge opportunities there are around this. So the key bit is finding the right questions, because we can have the most amazing AI and any other technology, as Rose and Nicholas were talking about, but if we're not asking the right questions of it, then we're unlikely to get useful, helpful answers in all of this. So that inquiring, creative mind is a really crucial bit in all of this for me. And the other bit I just want to share before I go into what I see are the opportunities. And one of the things also around the question is, you know, are schools going to be like they currently are in 2040? And my very blunt answer is I hope not. But I'm not sure, if I'm really honest. It's a highly resilient system that survived many sort of bumps and disruptions along the way, and most recently, as Rose was talking about, COVID. And I've also done some thinking around the difference between agile and adaptable, and this is very much my 101 version of it. I think we've had to be very agile. We've had to change what we've done in schools, but have we really adapted and changed what we're going to do longer term? I hope so. And certainly some people have around all of that. The challenges for many people in education, spending all my life working in and with education, is the zero risk approach of ministries and departments that they talk about wanting innovation, but with zero risk. And I always say you can't have one without some of the other. And so I like to talk about what I'm framing as compassionate innovation, and actually accepting, and this is a really important lesson for all of us, I think, in terms of particularly from a teaching background, there is no right answer. And actually, how do we generate practice-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based practice, and learning from those people at the cutting edge. And for certainly the excellent work that Rose does at Educate, and really having a research background to this, but to generate that research, people need to be courageous in some of their work around this. So what are the opportunities? I do love technology. I think it has amazing opportunities. But for me, again, there's a bit of a push at times, certainly in schools, just to throw technology at the problem. And I always say it's far too simple an answer for what is a much more complex problem, unless we change how it's taught, what is taught, and what we value in many ways. Hence me mentioning, what is the purpose of education, and not going down that rabbit hole. But for me, technology should be there to help learners learn better. And our current model of education and schooling is to help teachers or lecturers lecture or teach better. And for me, also to help leaders lead better. Because if we don't take the leaders and the teachers on the journey with us, then they can get in the way. No one deliberately will do that, but they can be the ones who are the resistors in all of this. I think the students they're going to be the easy ones to take on board. They're desperate for these new opportunities. So I'm deliberately going to start the wrong way around in many ways and talk about what about AI and education opportunities for leaders. Because having been a school leader, very bluntly, I say if school leaders say we haven't got the time or we haven't got the money, it generally means they don't think it's important enough. Now that's too simplistic. It's not quite as simple as that, but largely if I thought something was really, really important and valuable, we'd find ways, we'd go and source additional funding, we'd find times to make it happen. So if we don't really win the hearts and minds of school leaders, then it's going to be more difficult and much slower to change and adapt, which is what none of us want it to take as long as it could take. And one of the things I am started challenging a lot of school leaders in is around their own learning and teachers' learning. So quite rightly, Nick was talking around individualized and personalized for students. Absolutely couldn't agree more. But largely, and these are massive generalizations, the professional learning that school leaders and school teachers get is also one size fits all. So often in many situations, they're not getting opportunities to have that personalized, differentiated learning. And AI, like it can with students, can obviously be a really great driver to help them unearth what might be useful and helpful for all of them in moving forward around this. I also think there's a huge opportunity, and this is not just to stop the system evolving, because I strongly view it and want it to evolve and change significantly, but to become smarter. And I mean smarter in terms of how it operates rather than the traditional view of what smart means in a school environment. So blunt things such as, when combined with IoT, how do we make schools more efficient to run and effective to run? And lots of opportunities there. Certainly as a school leader, I'd love that AI personal assistant that can take minutes of meetings, but also more importantly, sort of point out cognitive biases that might come into play around recruitment or things such as that, to analyze the quality of the conversations that I'm having with other teachers and we're having as teams. And there's the research out, we know what effective teams look like, and AI to really look at that and explore that and to give us feedback to influence what we do and how we do it. The whole well-being piece obviously is a massive piece, and those well-being pulse checks for all is another great opportunity in all of that. For teachers, I think there's a huge one there. I always say, I don't know of any teachers who went into teaching for the planning and the marking side of things. And yet can spend over half their time is spent on, I'm not saying it's not important admin, but admin type activities as opposed to direct interactions with the students. And to enable and allow AI to do some of that heavy lifting is a great opportunity. And the teacher choosing where they engage and where they don't engage. Because I couldn't agree more with Rose about teaching students and ourselves more about what AI can and can't do, because largely it's a dystopian model that's demonstrated through Hollywood and everything else, and yet there are significant opportunities to really help with that heavy lifting that the teachers do on a day-to-day basis. And I've seen a recent example about one really helping teachers analyze how much questions they ask, how much wait time they give, and all those other things to really refine their own pedagogical practices. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it's already been covered, but super important, the actual learners. Obviously that opportunity to have the right information at the right time, delivered in the right way for the individual, gives everyone a much better opportunity to really evolve their learning into a better space and a better, more effective way. It can also help unearth if we need additional supports for some young people, rather than it going unnoticed just because they happen to be quiet, going unnoticed around all of those. Final piece of what are the, I guess, the possible implications from my perspective. And as I say, I regularly speak to groups of school leaders, and I call the briefing presentations shock and awe. And the shock is that we need to disrupt people's thinking just to help them think differently. And that feels uncomfortable. And that for me is an opportunity to learn. But the awe bit is, rather than look at, oh, wow, look at what's happening over there, and where emerges for me. So it's all well and good just disrupting and saying schooling is outdated and all these other things. But if we don't create an alternative, more compelling future, and again, AI can take us on that journey to, again, how many principals want to be spending hours and hours and hours on hundreds, if not thousands of emails, most of which could probably be answered by their digital twin around, some of the more mundane things that they get lost in at times. And Frank Diana, a futurist, I think he's out of Canada, Peter, but if not, he's America, so apologies for that, but I think he's Canada, talks about rehearsing the future. And I think there's a great opportunity to AI to help us understand the implications of decisions made. So what is there? There's possible implications. I think we need to really think about decoupling education and schooling and seeing it constrained as that's only happens within schools or only happens within universities. We all know that's not true, but how do we leverage the opportunities AI brings to capture some of the intangible learning that takes place on a day-by-day basis? Certainly, I'm learning things on being involved in this panel, yet we don't capture that, and potentially we don't value it because it's hard to measure. But AI, I think, gives us huge opportunities there. I think we need to take school leaders and people in universities, the leaders in those, and teachers on a journey to looking at how this can make life so much better. As Nicholas said at the start, it's not about replacing teachers for me, it's about augmenting them. How do we help people working incredibly hard with less and less sort of time to do what's expected of them, actually focusing on where the value add is, the human to human interactions that unfortunately sometimes get squashed. The amount of time they can spend on those gets less and less. Probably the other significant group of people we need to help educate around AI and about the opportunities in education and learning is parents. They have significant implications and impact. At the end of the day, I said to someone a while back, if you just take politics out of education, it'll all be all right. And I don't totally disagree with that still, but he said in many ways, if you help parents have again, rehearse the future with parents of different ways that education can be done that's not about 25 kids sat in a classroom all getting primarily the same learning, then there's huge opportunities there. There's obviously privacy, security, and how it's used concerns that need to be addressed. We can't just ignore those things. And that's, having explainable AI about what it does and doesn't do. And just because we can with technology doesn't mean we should. And the whole ethics piece for me is another really important thing of understanding, what value add, why are we implementing, whatever the technology is, why are we implementing that? And as I say, I guess to close off how I started with, if it's not helping the learners learn better, if it's not helping the teachers teach better, and if it's not helping the leaders lead better, then let's look at not using the technology and spend that quality time in the human to human interactions.
Thank you, Nick. You mentioned the word awe, so thank you actually for an awesome presentation. You couple of points you mentioned there very much resonate with me, and I'll be talking a little bit about it. Mindset, stakeholders, you know, what's in it for me, how does it impact me, hugely important. The teachers, the students, the parents, so really, really important there. And I'll be talking a little bit around ethics and so on in the final presentation. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Next presenter, next panelist is Peter Scott. Peter is a friend now. I've had the pleasure of meeting Peter on quite a few occasions now here in the UK, and invited him to speak at the House of Lords, and he gave evidence and did a hugely impressive job. Peter is a futurist, and he is the author of a book called Crisis and Control: How Artificial Superintelligence May Destroy or Save the Human Race. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Peter to the panel this morning. Thank you. Peter's dialing in from Canada, 1:30 in the morning there. So again, big thank you for joining us today. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thank you, Katie. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. And I'm going to start by calling out some hard truths that we need to look at. A recent survey by College Reaction and Axios came up with the information that more than 1 in 5 college students reported they do not plan to enroll this fall. And this is North American statistics here. Interpret this in the context of however these dynamics are applying in whatever your local area is. Of the people who said they weren't enrolling, 73% of them said they're going to work full time. Only 4% of them said they're going to go to a different university. And there are estimates that in North America, about 1,000 educational institutions will fail in the next year or so. I don't personally think that that figure is inflated. I was having conversations about this with people, knowledgeable insiders in that field before coronavirus was a twinkle in a Chinese bat's eye, and was being told then that these institutions were already on the brink. Now, there can be little question that they're being pushed over. Your Ivy Leagues, your top tier universities will do all right because people gravitate towards the big recognizable names in a time of crisis. The small, nimble organizations, especially the ones that were either already online or could move there quickly, they will be all right as well. But it's the ones in the middle that were competing on the basis of who had the most lavish facilities. And now they've got athletic stadiums, they've got state-of-the-art classrooms, lab facilities that are sitting empty. These are the ones that are on death row. And there are things that AI could do to help in those institutions. But the hard truth is that most of them are not going to do it. And the reason is that no one wants to look like the cause of failure. No one wants to be the one whose career is marked by, well, they took a risk and their institution failed, because no one can tell that that was what was going to happen anyway. But that won't be the reason they'll give. They'll dress it up in all kinds of language like, well, based on a careful risk assessment analysis, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, emotion is what runs the show when survival is at stake. And what it takes to be able to confront the possibility of doing something as innovative as using AI in ways that they haven't done before would be, well, if you can imagine a place where the executive was comfortable enough for someone in that meeting to be able to say, well, you know, the real reason I opposed this project is because actually I was afraid that it was going to leave me with so little influence that I was afraid for my career. And if you hear that and think, oh, well, that's not something that would happen where I am, I've not seen that kind of thing happen, well, then you get an idea of the sort of chasm that has to be crossed before we can get to a place where the real evaluation of risk could take place. And it's not impossible. I work with people who regularly bring the key people in enterprises to that level of honesty and openness. But it is uncommon. As Nick B said, this system is very resistant to change at its heart. And so what I think is, for those of you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid, you know, the beauty of this way that we're speaking here now is that those of you who aren't can just type MASLOW, hierarchy, and you can understand what I'm talking about before I finish the sentence. That you have to handle your survival, physical survival needs before you can deal with things up to the pinnacle of self-actualization. And what I think, and when I show slides for this, I animate that pyramid turning upside down, is that for the leadership in organizations now facing disruption, they have to handle their own actualization, their own enlightenment and vulnerability and openness first in order to assure the survival of their organization. So if they do that, what can AI do to help? Well, there are a number of ways that AI can be applied even right now, such as engaging students in the classroom or through massive open online courses, MOOCs, to conduct dialogues that assess the effectiveness of the instruction. They can be virtual teaching assistants, grading courses. They can be facilitating discussion groups. They can optimize the institutional knowledge and research by integrating and assimilating knowledge bases and pointing out where effort is being duplicated or there are gaps. They can optimize back office resources for things like financial planning, staff scheduling, and optimize course scheduling to a degree significant enough that you start looking at how what the impact is of speeding up time to graduate by a year in some cases. They can answer students' administrative queries and handle outreach for emergency or immediate communications. And if you have any question about whether that's a feasible thing to conduct that kind of natural language conversation, take a look at the sort of thing that GPT-3 is doing now. And it's not hard to imagine that that's possible within a few years. And in fact, all of these approaches have already been studied, researched, and or proven out in institutions that make the necessary commitment to curating their data to the required data literacy standards. There's no free lunch. You have to know what your data is. You have to curate it properly before you can throw AI at it. And now I want to talk for a minute about what we should be teaching. Yes, we should be teaching how to create and use AI, of course. But the elephant in the room is coronavirus. There's kind of a mixed imagery there, but bear with me. I want you to ask yourself for a moment whether our response to that as a people, as a species, has been optimal. Whether we knew what to do. And maybe if you're calling in from Taiwan or New Zealand, you might check that box, probably not anywhere else. But we all needed to know what to do. And how many of you went to a school that taught you how to prepare for or deal with a major crisis of any kind, let alone a pandemic? Don't you wish you had? The one course that we would have been completely justified in teaching in every high school, every country, every language in the world didn't get taught. Now, what were we thinking? We need to be teaching how to handle disruption. Pandemics, don't think we need to worry too much about that now, as everyone's sensitized to that. We've got that burned into our memory for a few decades at least. That will happen. So what else have we not anticipated that we need to be teaching? Obviously climate change, but also disruption from artificial intelligence, which will be both negative and positive. And part of the problem is that we don't understand its impact well enough to know what to prepare for. Maybe we could get people, we could help them to know what to do when not just their job, but an entire industry is automated. What schools teach how to future-proof a career? This is what we need to be looking at. Now, of all of the groups that I've spoken to about AI, the kids are the most rewarding. to speak to because they grasp the issues intuitively and rapidly. They're not afraid. And they don't get hung up on either hand-wringing or axe grinding. So I see in them the most hope for the future. That encourages me the most because they're ready to tackle these very hard existential problems. They're ready, as Nick said, to be courageous, which is what it's going to be, is really what it's going to take. And we owe it to them to prepare them as well as we possibly can. That's what I want us to take away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really thought-provoking, hard truths, as you said. Thank you for a practical presentation as well as a really thoughtful one as well. So fantastic. So I'm up next, last presentation for the next 10 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions through the chat box initially. So just a few more minutes and then you'll have a chance to do that. Now, I have just one slide that I want to share with you because it's such a nice, colourful slide, but also what I'm presenting is very visual. So you should all be able to see this slide here, which is my scorecard for success. So my work really is a year of research to write a book, but 30 years of consulting clients in education and all other industry sectors. Before I talk you through this particular scorecard, just really want to say that research has come out in the past month from Microsoft, which says that the UK's artificial intelligence skills are falling way behind other countries. We know, for example, that North America and China are way ahead in the race for AI. And what does that really mean in itself? The UK sees itself as a barometer for ethical AI, and I do quite a bit of work on a task force in Parliament, the all-party parliamentary group, looking at the adoption of AI across enterprise. So I'm hearing monthly through Zoom, often with 3,000 people dialing in from all over the world, evidence from people all over the world, people like Rose, people like Peter, and it's hugely impressive. And I'm actually quite impressed with the UK government's forward-thinking approach to it and with these actual all-party parliamentary groups. But I also know, having been on an education mission with UK tech startups like Century Tech, out to Dubai and other, meeting with schools all around the world, just how difficult it is to get people to break through that red tape and to make change and to start to bring in some of the incredible technology that we actually have and start implementing it today. And so I know there are some huge opportunities, and we need to, as Peter says, to not be fearful of being the one that makes that decision. If we don't make that decision, we are going to be seriously left behind. So I've pulled this together. I just wanted to talk you through a couple of the points here. And a number of them have been made already by other presenters, which again echoes and tells me that I'm on the right track. And also a lot of the work that McKinsey talks about is echoed here too. And this came out before their recent announcement about that. So it starts with mindset. And this could be having the right mindset to cope with the disruption of AI, as well as a pandemic and other kinds of disruption, as Peter rightly said. And it's about vision and openness and flexibility and realism. That goes hand in hand with number 2, which is the support. It doesn't mean that the management team or the board of the company or of the school or of the university have to know how to code and know AI inside out, but they need to give support to people so that it can be rolled out amongst the organization. They need to have that alignment. And that echoes with point 3, which is really being strategic about your use of AI and machine learning in your organization, whether you're using it in the classroom or the lecture room, whether you are using it for your marketing, for your human resources, for tracking bias and so on. It doesn't really matter, but you need to have a problem to solve. You need key performance indicators in place. You need to iterate. My book is not rah, 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 look at all these wonderful case studies of success. There are lots of failures as well. banks in Sweden that implemented chatbots too soon. Clients found it gimmicky, staff were threatened by it, but they iterated and used it a year down the line in a different way and have gained a lot of benefits, for example, onboarding customers for customer experience. Number 4 is about that experimentation, and I know Fountech do a lot of great work around their proof of value and proof of concept, so that's really important too. Collaboration was mentioned across this morning's seminar. Parents, teachers, the actual scientific community, the local members of parliament and government and so on. It's all really, really important that there is that collaboration. 6 is absolutely essential. Do we have the skill set in-house? Do we need to keep retraining and being on that journey of lifelong learning that a number of us are talking about regularly? Do we outsource parts of that and reskill and so on? This is executive talent, but also talent within schools, universities, colleges, and so on. That comes down to the culture of the organization, about fairness, about having a long-term approach, recognizing the what's in it for me, for your staff, but also for the other stakeholders in the organization, which boils down to an organization being agile, planning for disruption, as Peter rightly said. I love that idea of turning Maslow's hierarchy of needs on its head. Really insightful there from Peter. So planning for that disruption, planning for transformation. Number 9 is a subject that's very dear to me, and it's about purpose. It's about ethics. If you think of the work that was done by the House of Lords a few years ago and the recent announcement with the OECD countries about this alliance on AI, at a time where COVID and Brexit have made us quite inward looking and quite almost getting more and more nationalistic. I don't want to get too political, but quite inward looking as countries, we actually, because of AI and 4th generation technologies, need to be global in our thinking and needs to be collaborating internationally. So the international communities working together to think about explainable AI, not making decisions, not allowing the AI to make decisions, but to have that human in the loop, to have transparency and all of those key things, and to really think about, with an education hat on here, the ability of AI to democratize the best education in the world and to make that open to everybody. That's maybe a bit of a utopia, but it's something we need to work towards. And the work I did recently, where Rose got involved in this, it's small. Let's put it in perspective here. It's just a pilot with 2 schools here in the UK, and it's about if you like, closing the skills gap, because there were some data science students on it and there were students of marketing, finance and so on, but they got to hear, and these are 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, they got to hear from a panel of incredible people, PwC, people like Rose, myself, the Alan Turing Institute, Microsoft and others, simply giving up an hour of their time on Zoom. It's not a big ask, all free, no no sponsorship or anything like that, but giving them access to people who are going to inspire them at a time when the national curriculum is lacking in quite a few places. So I'd like to see that rolled out, and other people around the world setting up similar opportunities for our young people today, rather than them having to wait and future generations simply benefiting from it. And then number 10 is the roadmap. Put all of this into practice. Let's come up with that roadmap. Let's make sure we've got the authority, the budget, and the budget might mean we can take advantage of incredible PhD innovation grants. For example, the University of Surrey, I know, has them, and the UK's industrial strategy says that we want more of this to be available. And I know other countries in the world, as part of their industrial strategies, are putting forward grants and so on. So these are grants for businesses, but also for educational establishments to really be part of the learning and stretch, take people out of their comfort zone. And whether you're just graduating like my daughter, or whether you're like me and you're 30 years into your career, we are all on a journey of continuous learning. So that's what I really wanted to share with you in a very practical way as the final piece for what I think have been, some incredible pieces of insight from some of the best brains in the world on these subjects, AI, education. So thank you to my fellow panelists for really insightful comments there. And now I'm going to take the opportunity to give, we have got 25 or so participants this morning. We're recording this. So for those of you that join midway through, or those of you that like to share it with some of your colleagues and friends, family, it will be recorded as well. So now the floor is open. We have 30 minutes if we need it. We'll go right up to 11 a.m. UK time. The floor is yours to ask any of us through the chat initially, any questions that you might have. Who would like to kick us off? Not just necessarily questions, I'm also thinking here observations, comments. Maybe you have a piece of best practice or a horror story that you want to share with us, but we'd love to hear your views this morning. Let me start by, just while everyone's thinking and getting their questions together, actually I'm looking at I sent a message earlier to the waiting room, so let me make sure I come out of that and look at everyone in the meeting. There we go. A question I will pose to some of the panelists as well is how do you balance the need to, in times where budgets are low and you're having to keep an eye on the actual costs and so on at a tough time. How do you balance that sort of innovation, preparing for the future, whilst actually trying to keep the books balanced? That's a tricky one, and I'd be maybe asked that to, I'm thinking particularly Nick B and to Rose, who are very well entrenched day in day out with this particular area. So any thoughts there on that?
Rose, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
No, you go first, Nick, and I'll follow up. It's a good
Cool.
question.
Yeah, it is, and a really important one. I mean, it does, for me, we know there's limited budgets, and they're likely to be, unfortunately, even a bit tighter, but it's about having that real hearts and minds, having a real vision about what this can do, and actually it can release, and it's not about having less teachers, but about freeing up teachers to spend a quality time, and then investing in what technology that can do that, I guess. So it has to be quite a bit of a visionary there, and I've certainly seen it done in state schools as well as independent schools, where the leader, I'm going to use the word again, but is courageous enough to say, yeah, no, I have a belief this can make a real difference, and we're going to do it in a small way. So rather than put in thousands and thousands of dollars or pounds or whatever else into this, let's do a pilot project here, and that comes back to me for that practice-based evidence. We think this is going to make a difference. Let's give it a go here, and let's collect some data and explore and see if it does make a difference before we try and just throw loads of technology at it.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
I agree completely. I think it's very frustrating. There's clear data that demonstrates that the companies who are economically most successful are also the ones with the best education systems. So there's a financial connection, and yet it's really hard to persuade educational leaders, exactly as Nick says, that actually, this is a time when we should be investing, and we should be investing in innovation and risk. And it's not the leaders in the schools, often it's the people who hold the purse strings, and that's really problematic. But I think it has to be small steps. I love the Finnish approach to the 1% project. Let's educate 1% of the population about AI, and then of course that 1% can educate another 1% and another 1%. It's so modest and sensible, and I think that's the kind of approach we need. So small steps, I agree with you, Nick. And I think, if we can just help educational institutions, for example, to understand what their data is telling them more, we can help them to see economies, as well as, trying to persuade them where they might invest something. So it is that, but I think it has to be very focused. I agree with you.
Good point, Rose. And you mentioned Finland there, and the University of Helsinki have made an AI course available to everybody around the world, and it's impressive. I've actually been through part of it myself, so that's fantastic too. Yeah, great answer. So we're getting some great questions coming in now. So we have one from Dan, who says, given the learner will own their data or their digital learning record, who do we think will end up facilitating this experience and creating this technology? Will it be government? Will it be big tech? Will it be open source? Great question. I'm thinking that might be one for Nick Kay, not sure, but who from the panel would be interested in taking that one first?
I think we all have something to add to that one, Katie. I'm interested in hearing your response too, given your interest in the ethics of this. For me, I'm a big believer that the more data shared, the more innovation, right? So data sharing is critical for innovation. However, privacy, especially in the case of children, is hugely important. So I'm a big believer in not having that data be stored or accessible by humans. So absolutely gather it, let AI process it, make sense of it without storing any kind of individualized information, but then using that to enhance the learning experience, but then the insight stored, but not the actual data itself accessible by humans. I think the concerns are all about humans being able to access this and exploit the data. But keen to hear your thoughts on this.
I'll come back to it in a minute, Nick, because I'm just conscious I'm going to try and get through 3 or 4 more questions, and then I'll come back and certainly mention ethics as well. So digital divide seems to be an issue in most countries with limited resources. Are we expecting this gap to grow in the following years, or do we see plans to work on this while we're implementing AI in education systems? Great question. Is there need for a global organization for this to make sure access to education with technology is available to everyone? Now, I know the work of, admittedly, I mean, there's India and there's other OECD countries involved in it. The announcement was made in the last month about that global cooperation with very much these kinds of messages and objectives in place. So I know that that's part of some of those initiatives and those global partnerships. But does anybody else on the panel have anything to add to that?
I'll tackle it. Firstly, more and more people are coming online at a faster rate than ever before. So I think there'll be access to billions of people that are not online now. They'll be online in the next decade or so. So I think the digital divide from that perspective is going away. I don't know if a global organization needs to be put in place. One thing I'd like to see is, based on the belief that the best way to learn anything is to teach it, perhaps have a system where learners, kids, are encouraged to tutor others in remote countries or disseminate the knowledge, or have the developers of these AI systems make them accessible to people around the world. And I think that's going to happen. I mean, we're certainly planning to do that. And I know numerous other people are, or companies are planning to do the same.
Absolutely. Another good question here. Our current education practices are based in the times of the first industrial revolution. Trying to force in AI into such an old model, would we not be doing it wrong? Do we let AI generate the AI model for the fourth industrial revolution? Peter, I'm looking to you there for some reason.
Thank you, Katie. It reminds me of an old saying I get to use often in the aerospace context that I work a lot in, which is that if you take a bad engineer and you give them a power tool, you don't get a good engineer, you get a dangerous engineer. And so AI will amplify whatever we use it for. And if we use it for the wrong model, then we'll be doing the wrong model only faster. So I don't know to what extent AI can generate the model for the fourth industrial revolution, but this seems very much to me to be one of those things that is right in the wheelhouse of people at the moment. There are enough things that AI is getting better than us at the moment, that this is the one where we need to figure out what the model is that for teaching. I'm always glad that my kids go to a Montessori school, no rows of desks, everyone's learning at their own pace, helping teach each other and learning from older kids, teaching younger ones. That's the kind of model that I think we should be promoting at those ages, and seeing how much further it can go. This is that whole educational, that model, the traditional one, the first industrial revolution model, has to change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then the final question, well, there's more coming in, but ethics, this is a separate question. Ethics seems to be a big area of concern moving forward, 100%. I mean, I've been recently joined the editorial board of the AI and Ethics Journal, and ethics, as you would imagine, is always on the agenda in the work that we're doing at the all-party parliamentary group. Just to be clear here, I'm not part of government whatsoever. I am a business person on a task force looking at the AI adoption in enterprise, and it's a hugely important subject. So for example, and I cover it a lot in the work I did and all the research I did with big brands and dozens of tech disruptors and academics for my book. And you've got examples of hospitality brands, you know, brands like TGI Fridays, who in compliance with GDPR, I mean, there is a GDPR clause that, you know, you have to tick that box to show that you can show how a decision has been made. So if you're an insurance company, for example, and you are using AI to help make a decision as to whether a policy is going to be given to a certain demographic in a certain postcode, and the AI declines, you need to be able to show why that decision has actually been reached. So back to the hospitality example, you've got TGI Fridays, and I interviewed Sheriff Mitias who's the Chief Experience Officer, not a job title that we had some years ago, you know, who's saying that with consent, once we have the consent of our diners, of our clients, we're able to use machine learning, and they use a tool called Amperity, and they pull data from point of sale, from all kinds of areas in their organization. And it means that they can then personalize an experience and personalize marketing for all of those guests, but they need to have that consent initially. So it's all kinds of topics like that. And, you know, we've seen breaches of that confidentiality in the past, and I'm sure we will see it again. And I think again, this is where it gets political, but other countries around the world have different responses to this. And so for it to truly work, and for us to have confidence in an educational system where AI is very ethical, then it's making sure that there is a treaty, for example, on ethical AI. And it doesn't work in isolation. Let's say you're an international, multinational corporation, and you're working with countries all over the world, and you're using different AI software tools from different countries. How do we ensure that the way it's been coded, that the practices are ethical? So again, and then we get into autonomous vehicles and decisions that get made. So it's hugely complex. But it's certainly not a subject that we can tackle in isolation. We need that collaboration for it to really, really work. And we've got another question on this subject, which I'll pass over to one of the other panelists. Please share your thoughts on ethical studies in schools through AI technology for problems such as racism, gender-based violence, which could solve future problems in universities, the workplace, or outside. Are we more concentrated on career curriculum than moral curriculum? What a great question. Maybe Nick B, that might be something you might be interested in starting to tackle.
Yeah, look, thank you. And so I was looking at that, and I say it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it comes back to me. So there's obviously a lot of pushback, quite rightly so, around facial recognition and things like that. Yet it is dependent on how we use it in many ways, isn't it? I always say there's a good side and a bad side. I think Peter mentioned that in terms of how we use the technology. So I'm not sure, and Rose might know, in terms of studies around AI technology for problems such as that. I can't say I'm across the research on that space. The bit around the curriculum, yeah, as I say, for me, it came back to that question. It seems to be that, and it absolutely needs to be part of the conversation, but a lot of people just equate education with career. And for me, education is hopefully much broader than just what job people are going to do at the end of it. And that links, I guess, to that moral side of things. The whole conversation around ethics, there is, as far as I know, there's not a standard view on what is ethics and what isn't, as you can see how it plays out in different countries. Yeah, of course, my background, my upbringing, the ethics I was brought up in is the right version of ethics. And, trying to let go of and understand difference is a crucial part around that. And I was never involved in it, but I think the art of debating is something that'd be great, because there you have to take opposing sides, even if you don't believe them. Just that acceptance of difference, I think it adds value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that, Nick. Rose, did you want to add anything there?
I agree completely. I mean, I think AI can be very useful. I know about studies that have been done in areas of bullying, for example, but you generally have some kind of simulation that may be augmented by AI that allows people to interact in a particular way and see different perspectives. I also agree with Nick's point about debating. I think it's a great way of learning how to see the different sides of an argument. And interestingly, the point about moral curriculum, I noticed in the OECD's curriculum framework 2030, there is something in there about morals, but it's not trying to be moralistic and say my morals are right, but it's just recognizing the need for that kind of understanding multiple perspectives, which absolutely is essential.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rose. So another question here. It has been suggested that there should be a shift in what we are teaching young people, as well as how it will be delivered with AI. How do we begin the influence? How do we begin the influence to influence the shift in what we include in education? Yeah, good question. Who would like to answer that one? I'll start with that one.
I'll have a go, although I don't think I've got an answer. Oh, Peter, do you want to go first?
Sure, because one brief point is on a practical level, I think we have an opportunity here with the pandemic, like we have not had in many years, to make fundamental changes in all kinds of areas, and this being one of them. So it's a bit facile to call it an excuse, but it has made many things fluid which were previously ossified, and this gives us an opportunity to disrupt things that were desperately in need of disruption, but which we didn't have the leverage to do so until now. Go ahead.
I agree with that. I think it does give us an opportunity, but nevertheless, I don't underestimate the inertia with respect to change that particularly exists in the policy-making world of education, more so in some countries than other. But there's a desperate fear of loss of control. And I think that's a major problem moving forward, is trying to reassure without selling out, if you know what I mean. Because we have to change. The question's absolutely right. We have to change, otherwise we will end up just educating people to be second-rate robots, as you say, because we focus far too much on the sorts of things we can automate, and we need to really move on from that. And I think some educational leaders can see that, but far too many of them just don't and really want to continue. It's a bit like the moral point that Nick just made. My morals were, my morals are the right morals. It's like the education system that I did well in is the one that is the one we have to go along, and there's huge inertia. So I think Peter's absolutely right. This is an opportunity and we have to push it, but I don't underestimate how difficult that will still be, but we have to do it.
We must indeed, yeah, absolutely. Another question here. I guess everyone will easily agree that AI is useful to facilitate learning, but most will disagree about the role of AI in education. More specifically, education that leads to certification, which leads to job roles. So Jaddeep is saying education can give jobs, but learning gets the job done. Very interesting. Anyone would like to tackle that one? Nick Kay, perhaps?
Yeah, interesting question. First of all, I think it's very early days, right? So I don't think we have all the answers here, and certainly I don't know anyone who has all the answers in this area. We're at the beginning of a long and interesting journey. So yeah, everyone agrees that to some extent, well, I don't think everyone agrees, but most people agree that AI is useful to facilitate learning. But most will disagree about the role of AI in education. Yeah, that's the part we have to figure out. I think the concerns probably are around privacy, the whole moral versus career curriculum. And I think that's a perfect example of AI and human teachers working together, right? Where the AI develops the curriculum based on this corpus of knowledge that's being created, and by definition, the jobs that are being created. But the human teachers are there to help students understand morals and get into philosophy and figure out and clarify their values and get them to live with integrity, which then deals with racism and gender bias and so on and so forth. So I think we have a lot to learn. In terms of certification, I don't think anything's going to really dramatically change there. Although if you look at what the likes of Google and so on are doing, traditional certification is becoming a lot less important. I know at Fountech, if you come in and you can write great C++ code, I don't care where you've gone to school or what certification you have. It means absolutely nothing to me. So don't have a clear answer, but yeah, good question.
No, good answer as well. Thank you. When I'm working with both the educational organizations, but also corporates in all different industry sectors, I talk quite a bit about, the Gartner hype cycle. And I think what we've had for quite a few years, because we haven't had the facts and the return on investment case studies and the proof points, we've had lots of hype and speculation. And so all of a sudden, particularly in education, there is a fear, and people there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think what we try to do is to reassure a lot of people that in some instances, this is really like we've had 10 or so years of software as a service, where we've had a tool that can help us, do our VAT and automate and sync up our bank account to a package for doing our accountancy. This is the next layer of automation for our marketing, for our HR, for elements of the administration of scheduling timetables. This is not the big scary robots coming into the classroom or the lecture room and replacing the teachers. And I think we've had that hype of that inflated expectation. We've fallen into the trough of disillusionment because sometimes it's not quite as good as everyone said it was. And I think where we will head in the coming years in education and in other sectors is that plateau of productivity. And that's what we need to see. If as a teacher or a lecturer, if as a parent, if as a student, if as a barrister or a doctor or any walk of life, we are helped in doing the job. I call it the dirty, dull and dangerous. If there are tools that can help do the things we don't enjoy doing, that are boring, mundane, dangerous, frustrating, we will start to buy into it more. And I think it therefore, as a number of the panelists have said, it requires the forward thinking heads of school, principals, vice principals, teachers to start to invest a small amount of money to bring in an AI tool into the organization. It might be to help with their recruitment. It might be to, I know Century Tech, I know Squirrel AI, I know there are so many incredible tools out there that aren't going to break the bank. They're not a 25k virtual assistant or a major AI implementation. There are small steps that you can take. So, I tried to make my final presentation quite practical about how do we get started. And I want to end it almost, in a similar vein by demystifying and saying that I think, yes, there are huge concerns, there are barriers, but a lot of the barriers are our own mindset, because it doesn't have to be a major budget barrier that needs to come in the way. you know, and I'm 53 and I've been in my comfort zone for quite a few years. And, you know, I was at the head of the pack doing TEDx talks and innovating with digital marketing. And then everyone caught up and everyone was half my age, and it felt as if I was being left behind. And I had to go away, not as a technologist, but as somebody who needed to learn about the role of AI in business and so on. So if I can do it at my age, you know, it's out there. You need to take advantage of it in all walks of life. And I think my husband's a teacher. You know, I've worked with schools, both private schools, comprehensive schools, selective grammar schools, and I've got a sense of the different implications of how, you know, some of them have much bigger budgets. And so I think all kinds of organizations, and that's why I started my Leaders of Tomorrow initiative with comprehensive schools. We've got deaf students on the program. Diversity and inclusion is a really big part of that. And I'm just touching on a couple of the points that we skimmed over earlier. I think it's important that we don't have that inertia as individuals, that, you know, if we're a parent, if we're a teacher, if we're a business person, that we realize, you know, as Peter rightly said, that we need to be thinking of the young people today and not just waiting and hoping that somebody else is going to come along and change the curriculum in 5 or 10 years' time. We owe it to them today to act. And so I think corporate social responsibility, taxation, mandates, don't just wait for government to do it. You know, we can act as individuals, as schools, as organizations. So they would be some of my final points there. Another one here, we've got time for probably a couple more questions. Where would you say comes the biggest inertia to change in education, due to a fear of losing control or of standards of education lowering? Is it government and, sorry, that's someone else's message and it's just disappeared for a moment. Government, stroke policymakers, parents, or maybe companies that were built upon the standards and structure of education we've had so far? What a very good question. Who would like to answer that one? Yeah,
okay, I'll start with that. I think it makes what we said before, Rose mentioned, is it's got an incredible immune system, the education system, to put it as outliers. And I think the biggest problem is that, as Rose mentioned, those people who lead in education and been successful are successful in the old paradigm. It's actually quite hard to suggest that actually that's now outdated. So all the thing you base your image on in some ways is now given up, and it actually is no longer as valid and current as it was. So yeah, I think there's a range of things, and I think all of those things mentioned all play in to all of this, and that's the complexity. We all want, as human beings, a simple answer to what is a very complex problem. But I'm a big believer in building on what you said, Katie. You know, we often go to polarities, don't we? It's either utopian or it's dystopian. When I talk about dootopia, let's do little things. Let's just identify what, you know. And someone a while back said to me, AI, once it works, it becomes software. There's so much AI we're already using. You know, you go into PowerPoint and it suggests design slides. You go into your whatever it is, and so we just forget it's around there. It becomes invisible as opposed to seamless. So I think it's raising awareness as to what AI is already doing and helping us with, and then what might be the next step. What might be the next little step? We want to jump right to the end, which makes it super hard and too tricky.
Very good point. I love your Dootopia there, Nick. Right, I'm going to make this the last question. While we're reading out and answering the last question, those of you that give us your consent to take a photograph of you, we would love you to turn your video on now. While we're answering the last question, it'd be great to have some of us on video. And we'll do this obviously for marketing purposes, to share on LinkedIn, on other social media platforms, with the link to the recording and image of this morning's webinar. So for those of you that are happy to be seen, please turn on your video camera now. Your lovely faces there, happy smiling faces. Thank you all so much, that's great. My colleague Ashley will do some screenshots while we're chatting there. So last question, let's have a look. Oh, it's a long one, so I'm scrolling back up. Nick suggested it's worthwhile to ask the bigger question of what's the point of education in order to think through what the role of technology should be and how and what we should be teaching. According to positive psychology, an answer to that question is perhaps the role of education to skill up individuals to flourish in life. And again, according to this paradigm, the research suggests we are doing a remarkably unremarkable job. And we're quoting here Professor Martin Seligman, who proposed the PERMA, P-E-R-M-A model of human flourishing. So positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning and purpose. What a great question. So the question therefore is, are there other models that people could recommend with regard to what is the role of education? What a great question. Looking to a couple of
yeah, I'm not sure I've got the answer short term. It's a great question, one I need to consider. But and to jump back to Peter mentioning about you know, the approach that his kids are going through. We've been working with someone recently who talked about the tapestry and learning without borders, and so they've got, and I'm happy to share that, Scott. We can find a way of getting it to you and others interested. But this amazing tapestry of learning, which I think is a lovely metaphor in terms of the complexity and the interweaving of things. And there isn't time to go into it now, and I don't know it well enough, but there's a whole range of different lenses that really reimagine how we do education.
Great point, Nick. And it makes me, from a corporate perspective, think of purpose. And I think of Simon Sinek's why. You know, we all know as organizations, you know, what we do, how we do things, but why are we in business? What are we here for? And certainly when you hit 50, you start to have these kind of questions about your purpose and your meaning in life and so on. So it kind of touches on some of those really areas too. So I'm going to bring today to a close, because it's been an hour and a half of fantastic presentations, but also some really, really important probing, philosophical and very practical questions. And so thank you to those of you that have participated and asked such great questions. I hope we've answered your questions as best we can. Thank you to all of my panelists who've done an incredible job, dialing in from all over the world at all kinds of strange hours, particularly Peter. So a big, big thank you to all of you for your time. I think Zoom is fantastic. You know, there will certainly be some positives from COVID-19, having access, getting into the living rooms and bedrooms and homes of some wonderful people giving up their time, and you know, this kind of session being accessible to people all over the world. So thank you all, keep safe and well, and stay connected to all of us, and we'll make it available to you through LinkedIn. So please feel free certainly to connect with me. I'm sure my other panelists will be happy to connect with you as well. So take care, and we'll see you all on a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for organising.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Katie.